for the Congress to act. One is to look at a comprehensive predatory lending law. There's the Miller-Watt-Frank bill that's been introduced and pending in the House, and there are probably some other provisions. That's one thing that will have standards and penalties. Secondly is to increase investment in homeownership education and extend that homeownership education to beyond the closing. I think those are two immediate steps that Congress could take.
Has anyone in Congress endorsed your plan as of yet?
After they see it on C-SPAN.
Great. Do you believe that credit reporting agencies are intentionally misrepresenting credit scores of minorities?
You know, I don't know what the situation is with the credit. One thing I know is that there needs to be a complete demystification of this credit scoring process. And also, you know, what happens is, does your credit report have the same effect if you're 1 day late or you're 100 days late? Does it have the same effect if you fail to pay a $25 parking ticket or a $2,500 credit card bill? I don't know. People need to be educated. People don't know. People don't understand. This is a sophisticated audience in here. Most audiences I ask about their credit score, they put their head down. Because a lot of people figure, well, shouldn't I know my credit score? But a lot of people don't know and don't quite understand what goes into it. It's time for some transparency. It's time for some education. And it's time for a set of standards such that inaccurate reports can be penalized. People have to have a recourse. There's got to be a sanction if there's inaccurate information on your report.
Will the Democratic Congress increase the federal funding necessary to enforce the fair housing law, or will it be left to the states to do their best under state law?
You know, I think it's an open question as to whether the enforcement problem is a lack of money or a lack of will. Over at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. In other words, to get more aggressive enforcement, does it just take a prioritization of enforcement, or does it take more money? And that's a conversation that ought to be had in hearings on fair housing enforcement. And we would even go further. I mean, we believe, I think this is one area where the civil rights community is fairly unified, and that is that there ought to be light shed on the enforcement of civil rights laws across the board. We work very hard for generations to put these laws on the books, and there ought to be some analysis as to whether or not they're being aggressively enforced. If they're being aggressively enforced, that's what we ask for. That's what we can ask for. That's what we deserve. Not where people lightly enforce them, don't take them seriously, don't fill open positions when there are vacancies, that sort of thing. So I don't know if it's a question of money. I don't know if it's a question of will. I don't know if it's a combination of the two. But whatever it is, we need aggressive enforcement of fair housing laws at the federal level, and certainly if it isn't occurring at the state level, at the state level.
You talked about the rise in disclosures, or the rise in foreclosures tied to the subprime loans. How worried are you about how bad it could conceivably get in terms of foreclosures? How many people could end up losing their homes?
You know, you all remember the savings and loan crisis of the 80s. A good part of the savings and loan crisis was prompted by a high level of foreclosures. We had the problem in the Gulf Coast area when the price of oil declined significantly, and there were huge layoffs. What had happened is that many people were in homes with 17, 18, 19, 20, 21% interest rates. And those high interest rates made the monthly payments so difficult and so burdensome that people couldn't pay, and there was a high rate of loan defaults. The reason why we've offered these suggestions is because what we want to avoid as a response is the idea that underwriting rules are tightened up to such an extent that working class people can't get home loans, which is how it used to be. We think that with proper interventions, anti-predatory lending, proper focusing of subprime mortgages, that this can occur. So I am concerned. If you look at the numbers, most of the experts are concerned, and if you look at sort of the rumble that's occurring in the secondary market right now, it certainly points to the fact that we may be on a slippery slope when it comes to foreclosures. So we're saying there is a state of emergency today. It's time to ring the bell, and it's time for both industry and the Congress to work together to find some solutions and not get in an old-fashioned high noon standoff because no one can figure out what to do.
There are several different types of these new mortgage products. Are there any particular kinds that you worry about the most?
You know, that's probably a highly detailed subject. I mean, I think one of the things you hear a lot of concerns about are mortgages that have these escalations in the interest rates that come maybe after 2 or 3 years, and then it's on an adjustable rate. You've heard some concerns about that. But I think one of the hidden components of it is where you have products with no escrow for taxes and insurance, none of these other sort of standard, protective provisions. So I think there needs to be a broader discussion. And the question of products, I wouldn't want to see an overregulation of products. I do think that there need to be standards. Standards in terms of products and their match to people, because one of the things, and this is how this is tricky, one of the things we've learned is that one of the big problems out there, if you look at 50% of African Americans with subprime mortgages, one of the questions is how many of that set could have qualified for a more standard or traditional mortgage? 10%, 15% of that? Those are the kind of questions you ask. When you see numbers like that, they beg a certain question, that that's an inordinately high number of African Americans who are in a subprime market. I've got to think that there are many in that group who could qualify for lower interest rates, better terms, and better provisions.
What is the appropriate congressional response to subprime lending and the rise of foreclosures that often result?
I think Chairman Frank and Chairman Dodd, the two new chairs of the respective committees in the House and the Senate, following their public statements, have expressed great concern about disparities in wealth, income, and home ownership. Given that concern, dealing with this issue, because the numbers are going backwards. Folks, the numbers are going backwards. After, for a long time, going forward, they're going backwards. The home ownership rate is coming down. The foreclosure rate going up. Given that backdrop, Congress should do something. Congress should intervene, should do something. And I think we lay out in these Bill of Rights some ideas. But again, we welcome a conversation for other ideas. But let's not stand still.
Why should people who don't own their homes subsidize those who do through the mortgage tax deduction?
I think that because many people who own their homes today may have got it because of an FHA or VA-insured mortgage. Because many people who own a home today may have got a home because there was an interstate system that was built at public expense that made heretofore undevelopable land developable. People shouldn't make any mistakes about this. Public policy in the 1950s and the 60s spurred the rise in home ownership in that time period. FHA, which means government-insured loans. VA, loans available to anyone that had done military time, which was mandatory for men because of the draft